So we left off with just connecting our Redux store to our React application, but now we're trying to get some specific state into our component. The way that we bring in Redux state to a React component is by passing in a function as the first parameter to connect. And that function is traditionally called mapState2props. So inside of here, I'm simply just going to pass mapState2props. And I'll save this. And let's go back in the browser and see what happens. Get rid of this debugger from last time. Let's go refresh the page. And we still get this cannot read property to do's of null. So right now, let's go just simply take this to do's right here. And we're just going to map over some empty array just so that it has something kind of silly for now. So I'll refresh the page and we're actually going to see that we get a warning. mapState2props in connect must return a plain object, instead received undefined. Well, that's a good hint. mapState2props always has to return an object. And the first parameter that we get in mapState2props is our Redux state. So why don't we right now throw a debugger? We're just going to return an empty object. Let's go see what this looks like. Our Redux state contains our to-dos and that ID. What we've just done right here is passed in a function to connect. We call that mapState2props. Let's call this function try this. We'll save that, refresh the page, and we'll see once again, it doesn't matter what you call the function, but try this is not a great name. We should call it mapState2props. That's usually what it's called, and the reason is we are turning our Redux state into props on the React component. Well, hold on a second. How do we do that? Well, this object that we return, all of the keys will be placed on this.props for the component. So I'm going to place a property of to-dos, which is going to be my Redux state and whatever the to-dos are that are there. Remember this Redux state.todos, it's going to go to my reducer. It's going to go grab whatever the state is and figure out what those to-dos are. One of the hardest things about connecting React and Redux is figuring out how data flows throughout an application. So let's set a bunch of debuggers and see how it all comes together. I'm going to set a debugger inside of my to-do list. I'm going to put a debugger in render. I'm going to put a debugger in mapState2props, and I'm going to put a debugger in my reducer. Let's see which one gets visited first. Let's go. Don't want to ruin the fun. Refresh the page. The first place we get to is the reducer. Because remember, when we connect our React and our Redux store, we always need to run that create store function. That's going to go and retrieve our initial state. We then go directly to mapState2props so that we can take our initial state and place it in the component. Remember, we said that we map the Redux state to props. So we take a look at this.props, we actually see our to-dos. We got that from mapState2props. And we move along. So when you understand how data flows through an application, it's going to be a lot easier to wrap your head around all the things that are happening. But what we've done right now is taken our to-do list component and we have connected it to our Redux store, not only through using connect, but also by making sure that we have the provider component to specify what store we're actually connecting to. Remember, there's only one store. We're going to connect to that single store. We are going to then grab whatever state we want and place it on this.props. What's great here is we first go once again to the root reducer. Where do we go next? See if you can guess. mapState2props. And then we go to render. Now, this.props.map is not a function. Well, that's because it's this.props.todos.map. So I'll save that, and let's get rid of some of these debuggers. Take that out in my root reducer as well. So right now, I'm just getting some initial state, and I'm rendering a bunch of to-dos. That's really all we're doing right here. Now, I'm not going to get very far if I don't actually start adding some to-dos. So I'm going to need the ability to add to-dos and to remove to-dos. How do we do that? Well, we can make a form inside of our to-do list component. You could make this a separate component, but we're going to keep it really simple right now. What I'm going to do is simply render inside of here a form. This form, when submitted, is going to run some specific React function. So we'll say on submit, we could do something like this.handle submit. You might remember, whenever you do method binding, you got to make sure you do it right here. So we'll say this.handle submit is equal to this.handle submit.bind this. I want to only do that one time. It also means that I need a handle submit function with some kind of event. When this form is submitted, we'll do something. I don't know what that something is, but we'll figure it out. Same thing as before with jQuery. We want an input with some text. We can give that a name of task and some ID of task. We can also give this a label. Make sure we have that for our task as well. And then we're going to want some kind of button. And inside of here, we don't need all these styling. We'll keep it real simple. We simply just want the ability to say add a to-do. Now, if you remember, let's go refresh this page right here. Oh no, JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So in this case, got to make this all a div. Let's go refresh the page, and here's our task. And that's awesome. But what do we actually do with this task right here? How do we get that text sent somewhere? How do we see even what the user typed in? Well, we need to introduce some React state. And what's that going to be? We'll say the task is an empty string. You've seen this before when you've worked in forms. What do we want to do right here? When there's a change, we're going to call this.handle change. And you've seen this stuff before. Handle change. We want to make a pretty simple function here that's basically going to say e.target.value is going to be whatever we pass in. So this should allow us to change that specific input. This is the idea of a controlled input. What's going on here? Unexpected token. We got to make sure that we have an extra property right here, e.target.value. So here, this is simply a function that's going to call this.setState, and we're going to pass in whatever we typed in as that value. So let's go refresh the page. We can always check this out in our Redux or React DevTools. We'll connect right here. You can see we got that provider and the app and everything. Inside of our to-do list, we have a little bit of state. But it looks like we're not changing that state. Cannot read property set state of undefined. This.setState. What did we forget to do? This.handle change. Always got to make sure to do that method binding. Can refresh the page. Let's try that again. We'll type in awesome. Let's go take a quick look at our React state. Make sure that we're doing that correctly. And inside of here, inside of our input, we have that ID, that name, and that text. Inside of here, we have task, which is an array with awesome. So what do we do with this specific value right here? Well, we have to grab that when it is submitted. So why don't we, inside of handle submit, throw a debugger? We're going to save this, and we're going to make sure that we prevent the default before we do that. We don't want any page refresh right here. So we can refresh the page and we can type in hello. When we add that task, let's take a quick look at this.state, and we should see that we have some kind of task. But how come it's coming in as an array? Silly me, just want that to be the value right there. Let's go type in awesome, take a quick look at this.state, and we should see that the task is awesome. So this is just a simple way of collecting value in a form. As you go through this, you're going to make little typos here and there, and that's totally fine. But when you're dealing with React, or even before you get to Redux, you want to make sure you understand how to deal with controlled inputs, how to deal with method binding. Before you get to any of the Redux stuff, make sure your React fundamentals are really solid. When I submit something, what I'd like to do is add that new to-do. But how do I add that to-do? Well, I dispatch an action. So remember that since our component is connected, we have the ability to dispatch actions. So back in here, I'm going to type in awesome. And we're going to take a look at the component that we have right now using the keyword this. Inside of, and I'll bring this up a little bit so we can make that a little more visible. Inside of this component, we have a property called props. And if we take a look at these props, we see that we have the ability to dispatch actions. So what we could do is directly dispatch our action of add to do. Let's go get out of this debugger. Bring this back for a quick second, because what I want to do is set a couple breakpoints when I dispatch an action. We are going to dispatch an action, and that action is going to be add to do, and the task is going to be whatever this .state.task is. When we're done with this, we can make sure to clear the value in that form by setting the state to be an empty string. In this case, we'll just set this .state.task. So we are going to dispatch add to do. That's going to go where? To our reducer. So let's make sure that we get there correctly. We're going to put a debugger right here. We're going to save that. We're going to refresh the page. In fact, we're going to put a debugger as well inside of our map state to props. And we'll put it inside of our render. This is going to be fun. We have our debuggers back in place. Let's try to remember how the data flows throughout an application. So let's refresh the page. The first place we start, let me go refresh this again. The first place we start is in our map state to props. I want to make sure that we have a debugger right here as well. Good. We start in map state to props because we just got our initial state. That is then going to place on props a key of to do and whatever the value is of our to do's array. We're then going to render this component. When we type in some kind of task, the component's always going to be re-rendered because we're calling set state. So I'm just going to type in a simple task of A. When I add that to do, we make it to our reducer because I've just dispatched an action. And once we return a new state, we go back to map state to props. Notice here, this is my object with to-dos and an ID of 1. We then finally go back to render and we get an error. It all breaks. Well, objects are not valid as React children. The above error occurred with a list item. Well, that's okay. We can fix that up in a little bit. What I want to show you is simply just how this data flows in our application. So what we're going to do is fix that bug and see why this failed to render. So since we're rendering an object now, we want to make sure that we pass in that specific task right there as the value. What we'll also want to make sure that we do is simply just reset that form so that we don't set things individually. So let's go take a look at what our to-dos look like. We're going to go eat, we'll go sleep, and we'll go home. What we have now is actually the ability to add those to-dos to our Redux state. Remember, if we're using the Redux dev tools, we actually should be able to see what this looks like. Let's go bring this out a little bit. And we'll bring this over here. If we wanted to actually see what it would look like if we didn't add these to-dos, we can now change these values. Since our Redux store is connected to our React application, we can see what it would be like if we reset everything. If you ever want to make sure that you're using pure functions, you could always check in the Redux dev tools and make sure that things are behaving as usual. How about now? Notice here we're dispatching action of add to do with the task of how about now. And look at our to-dos. This looks great. We're using pure functions. If we took out this one, this is what it would look like if we time traveled a bit. Well, let's go bring it back. Let's get rid of this one. Let's go bring it back. This gives you such control over debugging and seeing how data changes in your application. It's what makes Redux so wonderful. So the last thing we need to do now is figure out how to handle removing to-dos. What we're going to do is pass in the ability for all our to-dos to remove any specific to-do. So what we want to do inside of here is pass in a prop of remove to-do. And we'll say this is where we're going to pass in some function called remove to-do. And when we remove a to-do, we want to make sure that we get the right ID for that to-do. So what we're going to do is when we remove a to-do, we're simply going to pass in that ID. Every time that we make a to-do, we'll correctly bind it with the right to-do. And up here, when we remove a to-do, we'll have a function which is going to dispatch the action to remove a to-do. This component right now we also call a container. It's going to contain our Redux state. And how do we remove a to-do? Well, why don't we this.props.dispatch. And remember, this function is going to accept some kind of ID right here. We're going to dispatch some action with the type of remove to do and an ID of whatever is passed to it. So we have to make sure in our to-do component that we actually have a button to add and remove, that we have a button to remove. So inside of this list item, we're going to go and add a button. And here on this button, we are going to make sure that we have an on click of remove to do. And here we'll just add a big old X right there. So let's go refresh the page and let's go eat. And when we click on this, cannot read property dispatch of undefined. So what's the problem here when we try to use this.props.dispatch? Well, let's go take a look at our to-do list. Inside of here, we're trying to use the word this, but we don't get the right value of this.props. So same thing as before, this.remove to do. Want to make sure that we bind the correct value of the keyword this. Let's go eat, and when I remove right now, looks like we're getting nothing. When I click on this, nothing happens. So how could we make sure that everything's working as correct? Well, let's go set a debugger and make sure that we're getting to that remove action. Let's go try this, add a to do and remove it. And notice here what we're getting as the ID. We're getting this dispatch, config, and everything. Well, that's because we're actually getting the event object. So we want to make sure that we pass the correct value for ID. So we'll go and sleep. We'll go debug here. We can see that event is the event object and ID is undefined. Well, why is ID undefined? What are we doing here that's not correct? So when we're doing this binding, we want to make sure that we first pass in as the value of bind the keyword this. Otherwise, we're not going to get very far. So let's go see what happens when we try to remove a to do. We're going to dispatch remove to do with that ID. And let's see what happens. We're going to eat. And when we click on this, it's gone. Sleep, go home. When we click on this, it's removed. How is all of this happening? We've coded this very quickly, but I want to take a big step back and go through each piece of this logic. The first thing that we did is we connected our React application with our Redux store. We did that using the provider component. We created a Redux store. We're using the Redux dev tools, and we create a store just like before using a reducer. None of this has changed. Root reducer comes from that file called rootreducer.js. Inside of here, we're simply bringing in our constants of add and remove to do. Those are just strings, and the rest is the same as what we had before. That Redux logic is really going to stay the same. That's why we started with building on some building blocks. That's why we started with some vanilla Redux. Just figure out how data flows in Redux, build your React fundamentals, and bringing the two together is going to be a lot easier. So what we then took a look at was how to actually connect this list with some Redux state. We saw that a lot of it happens with this connect function. And the first function that connect accepts is map state to props. This is where we go and grab some Redux state and place it on props in that component. We then go through all of the props and print out a whole bunch of to-dos, or essentially render a bunch of to-dos. We're passing in a prop of remove to do, whatever the task is, and some kind of key so that we're okay with React. This is not the best way to do it. There are better ways, but we're going to stay simple once again. When we remove a to-do, we dispatch remove a to-do with the right ID, which we get from binding. And when we add a to-do, we simply get whatever's submitted in the form and then reset those form values. What's important to understand here is we dispatch those actions and re-render the component. So once again, let's set some breakpoints and see exactly how things change in our application. I'll set this on render as well and go back to my root reducer as well. So once again, let's see if you can figure out how all the data flows. I'm going to refresh the page, and the first place we go once again, it's always to the root reducer because we run create store. This is the initial Redux action. We're then going to go to map state to props so that we can place any Redux state on props, and we're going to render the component. Right now, I'm going to type in something which is going to set the state and render the component again, set the React state here, not Redux, and then I'm going to add a to-do. And when I add a to-do, once again, I go right back to the root reducer because I've dispatched an action of add to-do. When I successfully return this new state, I go right back to map state to props. And inside of here, I now have my new Redux state. I then re-render the component with my new to-do. Let's do it again. I type in a letter. I'm running this.setState, so the code that's actually setting the breakpoint right here is this over here. Since I'm just changing a little bit of React state right here, the component is going to re-render, but no Redux state is being changed. I'm going to add a to-do, and before I do it, remember where we're going to go. To the root reducer. Back in the root reducer, I've dispatched add to-do, So we should hit this line as well. Once we return this new object, we go right back to map state to props. This function keeps running. It gives us our new Redux state. And once again, we render the component. How about removing one of these? Same kind of thing. We're going to go back to the root reducer, except here we're removing a to-do. And once we remove that, we're going to then return a new Redux state. Once we return that new Redux state, we go back to map state to props. We put our new Redux state on props in that component, and we re-render that component once again. What I'd encourage you to try to build now is the ability to update some of these to-dos. And in a later screencast, we can add the React router to the mix. But what's really hard to wrap your head around is just how all this data flows in an application. The more debuggers you can set, the more you can step through, the better you're going to understand how it all comes together. I'll see you in the next screencast.